most of the arguments that we're going to encounter are going to be using words in their ordinary sense. So for that reason, lexical definitions have a especially important role in making sure that we're on the same page in terms of using words in the same way with people that we're arguing with. So we're going to take a look at lexical definitions in a little bit more detail, and specifically we want to see the rules that we need to follow in order to give somebody a proper lexical definition and not give poor lexical definitions. So rule 1, our lexical definitions need to conform to the standards of proper grammar. So an example of rule 1 being broken would be to say that cloth is like something that's put out by weaving or knitting. And the problem here partly has to do with the fact that cloth, without quotes around it, it picks out the thing cloth or the kind cloth and not the word cloth. So this is a matter of what we call the use-mention distinction. If you want to mention a word, then you need to add quotes around it. And now we're talking about the word as opposed to talking about what this word refers to or picks out or what's in the extension of this word. And we're not going to want to say is like something. So the word cloth means I suppose means something. Put out by weaving or knitting. And there's probably better language to use in this as well, as opposed to put out. Probably produce, something produced by weaving or knitting. But the main points, insofar as it doesn't conform to proper grammar, is the point that we need to make sure that we're talking about the word in question. We also want to make sure that we're talking about what this word means, what it's supposed to signify. And we want to avoid wishy-washy language such as is like something that. And you'll notice in our everyday interactions, if somebody asks you the definition for something, we'll often proceed by saying, well, it's like this or it's like that. But that's not going to be a proper definition. Let's look at the second rule. So our second rule says, convey the essential meaning of the word or words being described. So it turns out that we can define a word in a particular way that will pick out the objects in question. So it'll make sure that it only gets those objects into its extension, but still not tell us what is really essential, what's fundamental about the objects in question. So here we have the rule 2 being broken. It says that the term traffic light means a red, green, or yellow light found on street and highway intersections. That's right, insofar as it's going to make sure to get everything that is a traffic light, right? That's going to get the appropriate objects into the extension. But if you think a little bit about it, it doesn't give us what's essential about traffic lights. It doesn't tell us that traffic lights guide the flow of traffic. It doesn't tell us that red lights tell us to stop, green lights tell us to go, yellow lights tell us to proceed with caution. And since it's not giving us the essential meaning that it directs the flow of traffic, it fails or it breaks rule number 2. And it's not a good lexical definition. In a lexical definition, what we do is we take a word that is used in our ordinary language, and as a result of being used in our ordinary language, already has a definite meaning. And what we then try to do is to assign that very meaning. So let's say this in another way. The word that we're going to define, the definiendum, is going to apply to a certain group of things based on how we actually use it. So it's going to have a certain extension. So then when we say it means da 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 da, that is, we give it its definiends, we want the definiends to have the very same extension as the definiendum. That is, we want it to apply to the very same things. So that gives us 2 ways in which a lexical definition can go wrong. The definiends can either include more things than what the definiendum actually does apply to, in which case we say it's too broad. Or it can apply to less things than it's supposed to, in which case we say it's too narrow. So let's look at a couple of examples to make this more concrete. Here's one instance of Rule 3 being broken. The word wife means married person. This definition is too broad. Why? Well, if we think about married people, and notice that based on our definition, we're saying that wife means the very same thing as married person or married people. But that can't be right, because married person or married people includes not only wives, but also husbands. So it's too broad because it's including husbands when it shouldn't be. So now let's look below at another instance in which Rule 3 is broken. This says that the word triangle means a closed plane figure that has 3 sides of equal length. So this definition is too narrow because there are more triangles than just those that have 3 sides of equal length. Right? The problem here is the equal length. So it's too narrow because all we're getting here are equilateral triangles, but they're scaling triangles. I don't know, isosceles, it's been a long time since I've done geometry, but right, we have all sorts of other triangles that aren't going to get into the category of equilateral triangles, but they're still triangles. So our definiends leaves out some of the things that we needed to get, and that's why it's too narrow. So we can make this a better definition by saying the word triangle means a closed plane figure that is made by three lines that join each other, 3 straight lines that enclose a plane. Right? If you've got 3 straight lines that enclose into a figure, then you're going to have a triangle. So we want our lexical definitions to be informative. So when we give it to somebody, once they read the definitions, the hope is then they'll understand the meaning of the word that's being defined, the definiendum. So Rule 4 tells us to avoid circularity because if we define a term in terms of that term, so if we define a word in terms of the words in which it uses, it's not going to be informative to somebody, right? Look at the Rule 4 here that's broken. It says the term chewing gum means gum for chewing. Well, if you don't know what chewing gum is, you're not going to know what it means gum for chewing, right? You're not going to know what that means either. So it's going to fail to be informative because of that circularity, because it's being defined by using the very same words that is used in the term in question. Rule 5 tells us not to be negative when it could be affirmative. So if there is a way to define the word without using nots and nos and things of that sort, then define it that way. Don't define it in terms of its opposite. This is like a special case of not getting at its essence, right? Of missing its essential meaning. So here the word wealthy means not being poor. As true as that may be, it lacks the essential meaning. It also lacks being informative. Well, being wealthy means having such and such money or such and such assets or something of that sort. Our next rule tells us that we want to avoid figurative, obscure, vague, and ambiguous language. And again, this has to do with the fact that we want our lexical definitions to be informative. They're of no help or no use in clarifying the way in which a term or what a term means and how it's supposed to be used if it's unclear, right? If it's not going to be informative to a person. So here's some examples of Rule 6 being broken. Here's a case of figurative language. The word evil means the darkness that lies within the human soul. Right? Whatever darkness that lies within the human soul means. It's this figurative language, and it's hard. We have some sense of what that means, but not a full grasp of it. We also want to keep it from being really obscure. So if it's a lexical definition, we want our ordinary Joe Schmo off the street to be able to understand it. So if we use a bunch of jargony language, then it's not going to be any help to that person, in most cases. So here we have the definition of vacuum cleaner. We say that the word vacuum cleaner means a motorized atmospheric pressure gradient creator intended for particulate matter removal, whatever that means, right? So that's not going to be informative. That's not going to be helpful to somebody who doesn't know what vacuum cleaner means. And we've already talked about how vagueness and ambiguity is a defect of cognitive meaning in our language. And so we want to avoid that as well because it's going to lack that informativeness. The word expensive means costs a lot. Well, what is a lot? So that's not going to be so helpful. Or the word faith means true belief. Well, what do you mean? Does faith mean that you truly believe, that you really do believe what you're talking about? Notice that's a lot different than a belief that is true. So you can have, you can truly believe something and it be false. Whereas you could have a true belief even though, even if you're kind of doubtful about it, if you have some reservations about it. Our seventh rule tells us to avoid affective terminology. And we saw with persuasive definitions that we can use affective terminology to mislead or manipulate somebody or deceive somebody. And the reason is because affective terminology will come with a positive association or a negative association. And if we're not being critical, if we're not being attentive, just that feeling of positivity or that feeling of negativity that is aroused in us can lead us into adopting a position about the things being defined, about the, well, not the word being defined, but what the word applies to. But when, as critical thinkers, we want to base our beliefs on the facts, not on just how words make us feel, not just on the emotions that words evoke in us. So that's why we want to avoid the affective terminology. And here's a case of that rule being broken. The word abortion means a safe procedure for women to avoid a life-altering event. Safe procedure certainly has a positive ring to it, and because of that, avoiding a life-altering event sounds like that's going to be a good idea too. And that could lead somebody, if they're not being attentive, if they're not being critical at the moment, to think that abortion is a good thing. And and that's a problem, because when we want to determine whether abortion is a good thing or a bad thing, we want it to be based on neutral facts, not on what emotions get elicited in me, that get invoked in me simply because of the terms that are being used. We don't want that to happen. All right, Rule 8. It tells us to indicate the context to which the definitions pertain. So with lexical definitions, it's going to list off all the meanings of the words, or at least the idea is to give you the meaning of the words that are used in ordinary language. And so some words are going to have multiple meanings. Well, if I want to give one of those meanings to somebody, I need to let that person know the correct context in which to use it. Otherwise, that person might be misled into using that word in the context that it doesn't belong, that it doesn't appropriately apply to. So here in Rule 8 being broken, we have the word strike, means the knocking down of all 10 pins on the first throw. A person needs to know that it's appropriate to use the word strike in this way, or to give it this meaning as listed here, when we're talking about bowling. Not when we're talking about baseball, right? Or any other case in which you might use the word strike. If you don't do that, then that person might be saying some things that a lot of other people will think is nonsense. Or if somebody starts talking about baseball and say somebody threw a bunch of strikes, then that person might get the wrong idea about what's happening in the game of baseball. Let's take a look at some examples of definitions and determine what rule has been broken. So here we have the word metaphysics, means the systematic study of metaphysical issues from a philosophical standpoint. So take a few moments, pause the video if you need to, determine what rule you think is broken. If you said circularity, avoiding circularity got broken. That's correct. And the reason why we know that that's the correct answer is we're defining the word metaphysics. So we're giving a definition to somebody who doesn't know what metaphysics means, and then we define it in terms of metaphysical issues. So the problem is, if you don't know what metaphysics is, you probably don't know what metaphysical issues are. And this is just not going to be a helpful definition then. It's not going to be informative. Here we have the next definition that we want to look at and determine what rule is being broken. It says the word desire means the actual essence of human beings, insofar as it is conceived as determined to a particular activity by some given. So take a few moments, determine which of the rules you think is being broken here. If you maintain that the problem is it's employing figurative, obscure, vague, or ambiguous words, you are correct. And in particular, this case is a problem of obscurity. When we say is conceived as determined to a particular activity by some given, who knows what that means? Right? That's a very obscure line. So let's look at the next definition. The word bird means a feathered animal that can fly. If you maintain that the problem with this definition is that it's too narrow, that's correct. So if we think about the class of birds, there's going to be some that fly, but there's going to be some things that are non-flying. So non-flying ones would include things like penguins. I suppose we probably don't let chickens. We don't think chickens fly. They might flutter about a little bit, but they don't actually achieve flight. Ostriches, emus, etc.